but he is the first to be open about it.
Yes, we have a different sexuality, but that does not make us in any way less valid or less worthy as citizens of this country.
With the government prepared to allow a free vote on a private member's bill, a lower age of consent now looks a certainty, even if MPs remain divided.
It affects tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people probably in this country, far more than fox hunting, and I really do think we need a free vote.
It's wrong that 16 and 17-year-olds should have to make this decision so early, when it represents both a serious medical risk to the rest of their lives and a departure from traditional Christian teaching, and indeed the teaching of all the world's great religions.
Gays may be marching with a newfound confidence, but the public remains sceptical. Nearly two-thirds believe homosexual sex is wrong. And there is concern among many that greater acceptance will simply incite homosexual behaviour and leave young people vulnerable.
All this is being done under the guise of equality. You can't have equality between natural and unnatural practices. And the next step will be, of course, if you're talking about homosexual activity and equality, they will be demanding to be married and to set up all sorts of family lifestyles, which can, of course, be dangerous for children.
Behind this row about age lie more fundamental questions about the nature of homosexuality and whether young people are born to be gay or can be tempted by an alternative lifestyle. And those wider issues were in evidence this afternoon as the Church of England General Synod held its first major debate for 10 years on homosexuality among clergy and laity. One speaker said gay people were no longer prepared to live in silent, hidden shadows. Neil Dixon, BBC News.
And the result of that General Synod debate on homosexuality is expected shortly. We'll bring you news of that later in the programme.
Tracy Andrews, who's accused of murdering her fiancé in a country lane in Worcestershire, has been giving evidence in her defence at Birmingham Crown Court. She told the jury that Lee Harvey had been killed in a road rage incident by a man who'd followed their car.
Tracy Andrews repeatedly denied in court being involved in the murder of Lee Harvey. She told the jury of 9 women and 3 men that she didn't kill him and didn't want him dead. In a voice shaking with emotion, Miss Andrews said she'd always been faithful to her fiancé. After the attack, she'd suffered a breakdown and attempted to commit suicide by taking 200 tablets because she felt a broken person and couldn't carry on without him. She was asked by her QC, Ronald Thwaites, whether she still had suicidal inclinations. "Yes, I do," she replied. "The only thing which gives me the strength to carry on is when I look at my little girl." Tracy Andrews described her relationship with Lee Harvey as very loving but stormy at times. There was a lot of jealousy and possessiveness on both sides, she said. And she added, "We both had a temper, but Lee showed his more often than I did." Lee Harvey's body was discovered in an isolated country lane near the couple's Worcestershire home last December. He'd been stabbed more than 30 times. Miss Andrews said Mr. Harvey was attacked by the passenger in a Sierra car which pursued them. She told the court it was like a dream and didn't recall seeing the attacker using a weapon. She said the man punched her in the face with his fist, and she added that she'd never seen the man before or since the assault. Lee Harvey's parents were in court to hear Tracy Andrews give evidence, but when she made reference to her fiancé's unhappiness at home and the fact that he didn't get on with his father, Mr. Harvey Sr. left the courtroom. The prosecution claims Miss Andrews invented a cock-and-bull story to cover up her crime. The mystery car, they say, was a phantom and didn't exist. Tracy Andrews will continue giving evidence tomorrow. Paul Newman, BBC News at Birmingham Crown Court.
An extra £2.5 million is to be spent by the government on investigating so-called Gulf War syndrome. The Armed Forces Minister, Dr. John Reid, said the move would double the resources already being devoted to researching the illness. The initiative has been welcomed by those suffering from the condition.
6 years after the Gulf War ended, the government is now taking Gulf War illness seriously. For those who served in the campaign, the mystery virus is proving to be one of the war's most enduring legacies. But for a long time, officials were unsympathetic to the hundreds of soldiers who claimed they were suffering from severe aching flu-like symptoms. Gulf War syndrome, the government said, did not exist.
We cannot accept anything that is not scientifically and rigorously proved. And we need to continue to provide those people with first-class medical care, but we cannot accept that there is any connection between their illness and their service in the Gulf.
But at the end of last year, the American government admitted that some of their troops could have been affected by the demolition of this Iraqi weapons dump, which filled the air with chemicals. Spurred into action, the British government revealed to the House of Commons committee that dangerous chemicals called organophosphates had been used to clean tanks and other equipment. Today's research will concentrate on a third possible cause of illness, the numerous tablets and injections which troops were told to take, ironically to protect themselves against a chemical weapons attack.
It's long been a view of the veterans that these vaccines, in terms of what was given to them, the amounts and the rapidity, need to be investigated. That's why I've done it.
For those Gulf War veterans who made yet another journey to the Ministry of Defence today to press their case, today's deal represents some progress.
Well, we're very pleased about the announcement in the Commons, and it's been you know, a very long time in coming, and unfortunately it's come too late for a lot of Gulf veterans. We know that on average there's 2 Gulf veterans dying each month, so for them unfortunately this announcement has come too late.
The most significant feature of today's announcement is the promise by the government that everything it uncovers about this mystery illness will from now on be made public. Having been on the receiving end of so much bureaucratic hostility and obstruction over the years, the veterans will make sure the government sticks to its promise. Tom Carver, BBC News at the Ministry of Defence.
Millions of people across Spain have observed a 10-minute silence in honor of Miguel Ángel Blanco, the young Basque politician who was kidnapped and murdered by the separatist group ETA. Mourners at his funeral today included Spain's Prime Minister José María Aznar, who pledged to step up the government's fight against ETA.
To solemn applause, the coffin was carried shoulder high through the mourners. They thronged the narrow streets of the small Basque town of Ermua. Here they remember Miguel Ángel Blanco as a local boy made good, a musician, a man who was planning to marry. He was a victim all of Spain could identify with, and it did. The country has been consumed by the life and brutal death of the young politician since he was kidnapped. Among the mourners who followed the coffin on its final journey, Spain's Prime Minister, José María Aznar. He's pledged the state will step up its fight against ETA and will win. True or otherwise, that's what people want to hear now. This killing has produced a new level of anger about ETA and its methods. Across the country, the protests have continued, silent demonstrations being held to honor Miguel Ángel Blanco and to oppose ETA. Even in the Basque Country, where the organization's limited support is concentrated, attitudes have hardened. Local people say ETA was never loved here, but now it is despised. Miguel Ángel Blanco was one of many killed by ETA, another victim in a 30-year fight. There has been outrage against ETA before, but many here believe this death is different. All of Spain has been wounded and will not forget. Spain is in mourning today for a young man whose killing has traumatized the nation. Officials say the country has never been more united in opposition to ETA than at this moment. The authorities are hoping to harness this grief in a stepped-up campaign against ETA. Orla Guerin, BBC News, the Basque Country.
The United Nations War Crimes Tribunal has sentenced a Bosnian Serb to 20 years in jail for his part in the torture and killing of Muslims during the civil war in Bosnia. Dusan Tadic, a guard in the Serb-run detention camps, was found guilty of crimes against humanity and other war crimes.
Already a convicted war criminal, Dusan Tadic arrived today to discover the full cost of his actions, knowing that the prosecution was calling for life imprisonment. As he took his seat in the dock, the one-time cafe owner was reminded by the presiding judge of the cruelties he'd heaped upon innocent Muslim civilians in villages and detention camps around Prijedor.
Intentionally and with sadistic brutality, using knives, whips, iron bars, the butt of a pistol, sticks, and by kicking the victims and tightening a noose around the neck of one of them until he became unconscious. Why?
all in the drive for a greater Serbia, she concluded. Tadic operated in camps including the one at Omarska, where hundreds of emaciated Muslims were rounded up and then tortured as part of the ethnic cleansing of central Bosnia. His defense team is appealing against the convictions.
At best, he was a low-level secretary in a very minor position in Kozarac after, the middle of summer of '92.
But for the tribunal, this case makes a point that, big or small, no suspect should escape justice.
Otherwise, what about the victims? Because our major concern is about the victims. The victims demand that those who have committed horrendous crimes be brought to trial.
Dusan Tadic was not a senior commander. He held no great position of responsibility. And yet he is a war criminal. He killed and tortured Muslim civilians. And that alone helps justify the existence of this tribunal, even if, for the time being at least, the ringleaders remain at large. David Eads, BBC News, at The Hague.
Lancashire's 5 coroners have published figures showing that 2 or 3 people die every week in the county from drug abuse. At a joint news conference, they described the figures as frightening and said many drug users had a casual, cavalier acceptance that they might die.
These coroners know only too well the misery caused by drugs. But worried that society at large is becoming complacent, they took the unusual step of calling a news conference. They said increasingly young people were showing a frighteningly casual attitude towards drugs.
The habit and the practice of some of these people seems to be to obtain a large quantity of drugs, legally or otherwise, take a massive amount, more or less all at once, all in one day, and quite simply, they're playing Russian roulette.
Daniel Ashton from Blackpool died 2 years ago after taking ecstasy. His mother didn't know he was experimenting with drugs until after his death.
Until Daniel died, I always said, thank God I haven't got that problem. I know Daniel will not ever take drugs, because we could always talk about it. And I know many parents feel exactly the same way as I do.
Drug-related deaths are now commonplace. The Lancashire coroners admit they don't have all the answers, but one called for a ban on GPs prescribing more than 1 dose at a time of the heroin substitute methadone. Too often, he said, it ended up in the wrong hands.
I find it quite difficult to understand why general practitioners prescribe methadone in pint bottles. Clearly, people are taking a small amount and selling the rest on, no doubt to fuel heroin addicts, and perhaps younger, more naive drug users are dying as a result of drinking from the bottle.
The British Medical Association's GPs committee agree that in many cases addicts should be treated at specialist clinics rather than by family doctors. Meanwhile, the Home Secretary, himself a Lancashire MP, said the statement by the coroners was disturbing.
We're going to take very seriously what these 5 coroners have said. They, after all, see the terrible consequences of drugs misuse on the misusers who've died, but also on the families and relatives.
What the coroners find most depressing is that they only hear about the very worst cases of drug abuse. Kevin McKay, BBC News, Preston.
The time is coming up to 16 minutes past 6. Still to come, a new crusade to stop teenage smokers. The government says from today, smoking starts to be history.
Curbing the junk mail menace, a crackdown on companies selling information about you.
And thousands of Kenyan students demanding political reform clash with riot police in Nairobi.
The Health Secretary, Frank Dobson, has used an anti-smoking summit to deliver another broadside against the tobacco industry. He said the only way to stop the carnage caused by smoking was to thwart the industry's efforts to get children hooked. The government is also considering raising the minimum age for buying cigarettes from 16 to 18.
Wow, are those big cigarettes or what?
By the time these primary school children have reached the age of 15, at least 1 in 3 will be hooked on smoking, unless current trends are reversed. 120,000 adults die from smoking-related diseases every year, so it's crucial for the tobacco industry's survival that they're replaced. Health education experts say children get mixed messages about smoking.
They generally seem to be very knowledgeable that it actually
causes diseases, that it probably isn't that good for you. But counterbalanced with that is the problem that there's a lot of peer pressure. There's lots of advertising of cigarettes through sport, sponsorship. So although they might realise that it's bad for them, it's very difficult for them then to be able to do anything about it because of all the other pressures that are on them.
The Anti-Smoking Summit brought together 8 government ministers to hear the views of international health experts, as well as business, sport and advertising. The government is already committed to banning tobacco advertising and sponsorship, but that's just the beginning.
Looking at smoking in public places, looking at support for anti-smoking programs in schools, reducing the number of parents who smoke, tackling the image of smoking as being cool and attractive. You know, all these are parts of a package of practical measures.
For 18 years, Conservative governments worked with the tobacco industry, producing voluntary agreements and controls. Labour's relationship is positively hostile. No one from the industry was invited to the summit.
I believe we could have contributed towards an overall agenda, an overall strategy, I think perhaps is the better word, and that seems to be denied to us and of no account to government, which seems a pity, and I think it's terribly discriminatory.
The industry's complaints won't bother ministers, who believe they have popular support for tougher anti-smoking measures, which will be set out in a white paper in the autumn. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
A paved walkway is being opened to the public on the site of 25 Cromwell Street, the former home in Gloucester of Fred and Rosemary West. The house where 9 of the couple's victims were buried was demolished by Gloucester City Council. A walkway was the preferred option after public consultation and discussions with relatives of the victims.
The government watchdog is taking action to control the way public utility companies pass customer information to so-called junk mail businesses. An enforcement notice has already been served on British Gas, and warnings have been sent to 2 electricity companies.
It's junk mail or direct marketing, depending on your point of view. It's a £5.5 billion industry that's growing fast, but many wish it wasn't.
I try to always tick the box and say I don't want any. The sheer volume is just incredible.
Every time I receive something, I think of the tree that's gone, you know.
The Data Protection Registrar has had hundreds of complaints. She's investigating a leaflet sent by British Gas to its 19 million customers. They're told they can opt out of receiving information on products that, quotes, would make your life more comfortable.
That seemed to me to be far too broad, and in any event, in the sort of circumstances in which they obtained your personal information, it seems to me that in the interests of fairness and to comply with the Data Protection Act, they needed to ask for your consent and not to ask you to say you objected.
British Gas now has 28 days to challenge her, but it says customers shouldn't be denied the opportunity to hear about products and services that offer real benefits. And that's backed up by the direct marketing industry.
Notifying a consumer what you're going to do with their personal information once they've collected it and who it is that is collecting it, and giving them an opportunity to object to whatever it is that's going to happen to their personal information is sufficient. And in relation to all other commercial companies in direct marketing, that's a standard practice and accepted by everyone.
Your records are wrong! A television campaign's already started, advising people to check information held on them by any company because it might be wrong. If any organisation refuses, the Data Protection Registrar wants to know. Nicola Carslaw, BBC News.
The Serious Fraud Office has warned small investors to watch out for con men peddling unusual schemes. In its annual report, the SFO warns that investment frauds now make up half of investigators' caseloads.
The Ostrich Farming Corporation is one of 42 suspected frauds against small investors currently being investigated by the Serious Fraud Office. The company promised annual returns of more than 50%, but it crashed last year, owing investors more than £20 million. The SFO today warned people who'd just received Building Society windfall payments to be careful with their nest eggs.
We're seeing that the ordinary man in the street is really at very severe risk now from fraud, and we're issuing a warning, which is the first time the SFO has done this, to tell people to be on the lookout for novel and unusual ways of trying to take their money off them, so that if they're offered any opportunities that strike them as slightly strange, we're urging people to take independent professional advice before they part with any money.
The SFO wants judges to take tougher action against fraud. Today it urged them to impose punitive fines on fraudsters and to disqualify them from managing any investments made by members of the public. In the past, the SFO has had a poor conviction rate in major fraud trials. But this year was something of an exception, with 12 out of 14 defendants convicted. That includes businessman Abbas Gokul, who was sentenced to 14 years in jail for the biggest fraud in British legal history. The Serious Fraud Office has been seen mainly as an investigator and prosecutor of large-scale corporate frauds, a role in which it's achieved mixed results. Now it's hoping that its new image as the champion of the small investor will prove more successful. Greg Wood, BBC News, at the Serious Fraud Office.
A meat hygiene plant and a cold storage depot are being closed down by the government following concerns about food safety. The two plants, believed to be in Stoke-on-Trent and Hertfordshire, were not meeting health and hygiene standards. The Agriculture Minister, Jack Cunningham, says he's determined to crack down hard on anyone who runs risks with public safety.
Hopes for industrial peace at British Airways rose a little today. Ground staff lifted the immediate threat of a strike over the sale of the catering operation by asking for more talks. The airline described the move as very positive. BA is still trying to get back to normal after last week's separate three-day strike by cabin crew over a new pay structure.
British Airways flights were still disrupted today, 2 days after the strike ended, and it may be midweek before the full schedule is running. At Heathrow, just over half European flights were taking off. Domestic services were similarly hit, but most planes on intercontinental routes did get away. But there was better news for BA when union leaders representing ground staff, including check-in workers and baggage handlers, sought more talks in their dispute over the selling off of the airline's in-house catering operation, lifting the immediate threat of industrial action. Meanwhile, union leaders representing the cabin crews who went on strike are continuing to draw up their proposals for saving BA £42 million. Worries that BA might suspend strikers, so complicating the peace talks, proved groundless. Hundreds of crews who'd reported sick during the strike are also back at work. BA's Chief Executive Bob Ayling will face shareholders, many of them rank-and-file staff members, at the company's annual meeting tomorrow. Those shareholders may well back the plan to cut airline costs. They'll be worried about the outlook as the peak holiday season approaches. John Fryer, BBC News.
Large areas of Central Europe have been devastated by floods, described as the worst this century. At least 36 people in southwest Poland have died, and hundreds of towns and villages have had to be evacuated. The same weather system has also hit the Czech Republic, where more than 30 have died and tens of thousands had to be evacuated.
Thousands of Kenyan students demanding the resignation of President Moi have clashed with riot police in the capital, Nairobi. In their third protest in a week, they demanded changes in the constitution before this year's elections. At least 9 people have died in Kenya's worst unrest for 7 years. Britain is among 22 countries pressing for reform.
It wasn't just the police that were the targets of the students. The very state and the way it's run was in their sights. Unhappy and frustrated, they want change. The police responded with rubber bullets and volleys of tear gas. A standoff was resolved by a charge onto the Polytechnic campus. And a violent, ill-disciplined force took their anger out on a news photographer. These type of images have already brought considerable international condemnation, but today's spat was nothing like last Monday, when up to 9 people died in the suppression of pro-reform rallies, and police even beat up people in Nairobi's cathedral. A special service has been held there to cleanse the cathedral of the taint of blood and violence. A number of churches support the call for pre-election constitutional reforms, and the cathedral service became an event where every word was weighed and then flung in the face of the government, first by a beaten-up clergyman who called for a boycott if an election takes place without changes.
Moi will declare his elections. It will be his own elections.
To some opposition MPs, the language of liberation from colonialism is now being applied to the demand for reform.
Looking at the events in Kenya today, one is left with no choice but to believe that our people are crying for freedom.
The way in which violence flares so quickly is already worrying investors, but the government is not showing signs of bowing to the demands of the reformists, and the tension remains high. Martin Dawes, BBC News, Nairobi.
On to football now, and the Newcastle winger David Ginola is to join Tottenham Hotspur after agreeing terms with the North London club. The 30-year-old Frenchman played an important role in Newcastle's UEFA Cup run last season, scoring one of the goals of the year against Ferencváros in October. Tottenham are believed to have agreed to a £2.5 million fee for the player.
As we reported earlier, the General Synod of the Church of England has been holding its first debate on homosexuality in 10 years. They've been discussing a report by the House of Bishops which accepts that lifelong faithful homosexual relationships are acceptable among the laity but not the clergy. Well, I'm joined now from York by our religious affairs correspondent Alex Kirby. Alex, the debate should have ended by now. Why is it still going on?
Well, yes, it should have ended a quarter of an hour ago. It began half an hour early, so they're 45 minutes overtime. I think it's running on and on because passions are running high. We heard one speaker in there saying that homosexuals not only are wrong, but always know that they're wrong. On the other hand, a gay member of the Synod said the church was a dangerous and unwelcoming place for gay people. What we are seeing is the bishops trying to hold the line, trying to do a holding operation, and I think the game was given away in a sense by the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, when he said during the debate that he foresaw no major change in the church's position in the foreseeable future. That, I think, is what we shall hear in a couple of minutes when the debate ends.
Well, no major change, but why is this such a difficult issue for the Church of England?
It's a difficult issue, partly because some of it, the traditionalist wing, bases itself on the Bible and says you transfer what the Bible said 2,000 years ago to today, and that rules out homosexual activity. The campaigners, the gay and lesbian groups, say, well, the church, the world has moved on. We have to adapt what the Bible said then to what the world is now. The bishops are trying to steer a middle line because they want to preserve the unity of the church at all costs. I think they will have done it for this year at this meeting. I think it's not certain that they will manage to do so next year when the Lambeth Conference of Anglican bishops from around the world meets, and in future years I think it will come back to the Synod again and again. The campaigners will not give up.
Alex, thanks very much indeed. And we should have the result of that vote in the next national news, which is, of course, at 9 o'clock.
From the 6 o'clock team, good evening.
Good evening.
This week on Celebrity Ready Steady Cook, is it Lloyd?
Oh, I say tomato.
Or is it Floyd?
All else fails, I was taught by my mother, a large glass of
Fern's got far too many cooks to deal with.
Some heather here. What is this? It looks like, you know, I was brought up where all this heather grew. And we never knew that was an ingredient.
June Whitfield and Rory Bremner. Celebrity Ready Steady Cook, Friday at 8 on BBC One.
This is BBC Scotland 1. We're now with Jackie Bird. We're reporting Scotland.
Tonight, why did my son die? The father of a 9-year-old boy killed in a helicopter crash speaks out.
If I find out he's not in a seatbelt, there'll be trouble.
Two Scots drugs barons each sentenced to 25 years in jail. And looking ahead to the Open as Tiger Mania hits Troon. Good evening. The father of the 9-year-old boy killed in a helicopter crash near Forfar says he wants to know why it took off in bad weather and how his son was thrown out of the aircraft. Investigators are beginning their detailed examination of the wreckage of the crash near Glamis Castle. From there, Tim Reid reports.
Accident investigators sifting through the wreckage today as further questions about the crash continue to be asked. Whether it should have taken off in what were, according to the police, atrocious weather conditions, whether all the passengers were correctly strapped in, and why it took so long to inform relatives who were near the scene. A team from the Accident Investigation Branch of the Department of Transport arrived at Glamis early this morning to find out how schoolboy Gary Malley died.
I really can't speculate what the causes of the accident
may or may not turn out to be at this time. There is still a lot of information to be gathered. My colleague is currently talking to the pilot of the aircraft.
9-year-old Gary had been with his two closest friends on the flight during a fun day yesterday at Glamis Castle. He was killed after being thrown from the wreckage of the Bell 206 Jet Ranger when it came down minutes after taking off on a joy trip for special needs.